Pastor Mike is not here today. He is at Parkland Chapel in Farmington. He is sharing with them all that God has done here at AV. Because their pastor is in San Diego sharing with that church that he came out of everything that God is doing in Farmington and in AV. So we all drew straws, and you guys got the short straw, and so you're stuck with me. So apologies. Any complaints can be forwarded to Pastor Mike. You can fill those out and leave them on his desk after the service. So we're going to be jumping into chapter 4 of Joshua, picking up where Pastor Mike left off last week. I will be reading all the scripture from the CSB, the Christian Standard Bible. It's kind of my go-to Bible and has been for a while. So you are free to read whatever translation you want. If you don't have a Bible, we have Bibles out there on a table. But if you have a Bible app and you want to change it to the CSB, you're welcome to. If not, that's fine. Just feel free to translate in your head any of the words you, anytime I say you or anything related, to thee and thou, and we'll all be just fine. So it should be okay. We're going to do a quick recap of Joshua chapters 1 through 3. So Moses has died, and now Joshua is leading the people of Israel. Joshua sent spies to recon Jericho and the area. They were discovered, but they were hidden by Rahab, a prostitute. And now the people of Israel they are crossing right now. They are crossing the Jordan in a very similar fashion to how the generation before them crossed the Red Sea. So that is where we are picking up in Joshua. So we are going to start in Joshua chapter 4, verse 1. After the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord spoke to Joshua. Choose 12 men from the people, 1 man for each tribe, and command them, take 12 stones from this place in the middle of the Jordan where the priests are standing. Carry them with you and set them down at the place where you spend the night. So Joshua summoned the 12 men he had selected from the Israelites, 1 man for each tribe. And he said to them, go across to the ark of the Lord your God in the middle of the Jordan. Each of you lift a stone onto his shoulder, 1 for each of the Israelite tribes, so that this will be a sign among you. In the future, when your children ask, what do these stones mean? You should tell them, the water of the Jordan was cut off in front of the ark of the Lord's covenant. When it crossed the Jordan's water was cut off. Therefore, these stones will always be a memorial for the Israelites. The Israelites did just as Joshua had commanded them. The 12 men took stones from the middle of the Jordan, 1 for each of the Israelite tribes, just as the Lord had told Joshua. They carried them to the camp and set them down there. Joshua also set up 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan where the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant were standing, and the stones are still there today. The priests carrying the ark continued standing in the middle of the Jordan until everything was completed that the Lord had commanded Joshua to tell the people, in keeping with all that Moses had commanded Joshua. The people hurried across, and after everyone had finished crossing, the priests with the ark of the Lord crossed in the sight of the people. The Reubenites, Gadites, and half the tribe of Manasseh went in battle formation in front of the Israelites as Moses had instructed them. About 40,000 equipped for war crossed to the plains of Jericho in the Lord's presence. On that day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they revered him throughout his life as they had revered Moses. The Lord told Joshua, command the priests who carry the ark of the testimony to come up from the Jordan. So Joshua commanded the priests, come up from the Jordan. When the priests carrying the ark of the Lord's covenant came up from the middle of the Jordan and their feet stepped out on solid ground, the water of the Jordan resumed its course, flowing over all the banks as before. The people came up from the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month and camped at Gilgal on the eastern limits of Jericho. So there are a lot of theological connections and rabbit trails that we could chase today. I did this week. I got really lost in some of them because they were really interesting. Parallels between this crossing and the Red Sea crossing. Connections of Jesus and him being baptized in the Jordan and other things that happened in the Jordan. Baptism in general and how we use it, and communion as ritual memorials. And they were all super interesting, and I dare you to dig into those on your own time. But this morning, we are going to hang around these stones for a little while. Memorial stones are common to us. We use them for a lot of different things, primarily as grave markers, right? We have memorial stones all over the place. We also have them as battlefield markers. We have a lot of them around here, and they're granite, and their color makes them kind of difficult to see on green grass. So sometimes I miss them because I'm colorblind. So sometimes I miss them altogether, but they're there. They're actually all over Arcadia Valley. I'm sure that you've noticed them. And if you've lived here for a long time, you probably don't notice them anymore because you just look right past them, right? In fact, Lucas and Sarah Underhill, they have one in their front yard, actually. And I was out there probably 12 times before I finally saw it. And it's right next to the road as you cross over the bridge going to their house. These things are common for us. We have them, we have all kinds of monuments. We have all kinds of things that we set in stone so that we remember things. And this was the same for the Israelites. These stones would be a memorial, a reminder of what God had done for them in this place. And there would be other festivals that they would do later. You're probably thinking some of them now. Some festivals and different things that they would do to memorialize other things that God had done for them. But this one, this particular one, was for this. This was them putting down a reminder so that they could tell their children. This was a prompt. This was something for people to walk past and go, what is that? Have you ever been out somewhere with your kids and them ask you, what is that thing or what is that thing? And then you start to tell them and then they roll their eyes because they're like, I didn't really want like that long of an answer. Yes, son, well, back in high school, this is, whatever. And they're like, I didn't care that much. Just don't. Yeah. So this was meant to be that. It was meant to be a prompt for kids and other people to see this thing and ask, why are these stones here? Their journey out of Egypt was finally complete. They'd gone through the wilderness, but the destination itself of Canaan was going to require new hardships, new trials, and even more faith. These memorial stones were supposed to remind them and future generations of what God had done. Did you know that in Germany and another handful of European countries, there is an ongoing project called Stolperstein? If you know German way better, forgive me for probably having butchered that really bad. My German is not what it used to be. It's a lie. It was never good. But I watched a lot of Hogan's Heroes as a kid, so that's where I picked up most of my German. But there is this project, and translated into something I can actually say, Stumbling Stones is what it means. It's a project called Stumbling Stones. These small brass plaques are embedded in the ground or in pavement in front of homes and schools and universities, synagogues and workplaces. They have the name of someone, including their birth date, and if they know it, the date that they died at the hands of the Nazi regime. Every one of these stones is connected to someone who died during the Holocaust. There are more than 45,000 of these stones currently set in 17 countries, including Germany. Some of them even stick out of the ground just a little bit, and they literally cause people to stumble over them. They are meant for children to walk across, to find them, or to actually stumble over them and see and ask, why are these stones here? The artist who came up with the idea quotes the Jewish Talmud as his inspiration, saying, a person is only forgotten when his or her name is forgotten. And even though these stones only take up a few inches, all 45,000 of them comprise the largest Holocaust memorial in the world. Future generations are going to find these. They're going to walk across them, and they're going to ask, why are these stones here? Who are these people? And they're going to be told a story about hate and war and evil and the things that human beings are capable of. And most importantly, they're going to be reminded that every time you see these, this is something you're supposed to always think about so that way we never let this happen again. For Joshua, the monument that they were building was not for something terrible to remember. It was something good to remember. It was a time God delivered them. And then when their kids went past, it was, what are these stones for? I'm so glad you asked, guys. Let me tell you. Joshua is one of my favorite Old Testament books, mostly because I'm a sucker for a good fight scene. And there are a lot of battles in Joshua, and I love getting to read that stuff. But also, I've always been hung up on this story, this physical reminder of God's goodness. I think that's awesome. So almost 2 years ago, my wife Heather got really sick, and it was spurred on by an event, and after that, it was a lot of ER visits and doctor visits, and our life kind of went upside down. And if you knew my wife before this stuff happened, you would know that she is an incredibly strong, stubborn, she told me I could say that, stubborn woman who will charge through walls if she needs to, and even if she doesn't, just to prove she can. And this really knocked the legs out from underneath her. So she was trying to find ways to keep busy when she could no longer work. And she's really been into art for a long time, but never really had the time. So she had the time. So she started painting and drawing. And one of the things she wanted to do was she wanted to paint on rocks. And so before I knew it, we were spending hundreds of dollars on paint and markers and these particular round colored stones that she wanted to paint on. And so before I knew it, Amazon boxes were filling up with rocks. So you can buy anything on Amazon. And one day, the actual delivery driver, I bought a bulk of them because it seemed, like a better financial decision if you're buying rocks, to buy a bulk. And so he actually brought it to the doorstep, and I opened the door to take it from him, and he goes, "Man, are you guys ordering rocks or bricks or something?" And I was like, "It's funny you say that. Yes, we are." Which he thought was great, and he said, "I never know what's in these boxes." But he had a pretty good guess. So she was working on these stones, and we were talking about things, and I was reading through Joshua again, and we were talking about this, and we come up with the idea, well, for us, we're in the middle of this. We don't know when this is going to be over. Israel didn't know when the invasion of Canaan was going to be over. But God said, right now, before you even get into that, memorialize what I've already done. So that's what we thought we would do. So we took these rocks, and so we started writing on them things that God had done for us. And we put them outside of our back door, so that way every time we walked out or walked in, we saw them, and we would be reminded. And we thought that would be a really good thing, taking Scripture incredibly literally and putting these stones outside of our door as little mini testimonies to remind us. So if you know us really well, you're going to know some of these stories, and I'm going to tell really short, condensed versions of some of these. And I wasn't going to share any of our story at all, mostly because a lot of you know it. And if you're anything like our kids, then you're like, oh, we're going to hear this again. And so I wasn't going to even share any of it again. I was going to seriously go, these are our stories. These are the big stories. And then I was going to move on. And I kind of felt convicted about it because they're not just our stories. They are stories of the faithfulness of God. And the stones that were piled up there were not just the story of how the Israelites crossed the Jordan. It was God's faithfulness, what he had brought them from and what he was getting ready to do. It was kind of the midpoint. So I'm going to go through a couple of these. Bear with me if you know them really well. I apologize. If you're hearing this again, this would be a good time for you to go to the bathroom because you're going to know some of these stories. So I was born with a bleeding disorder called hemophilia. It is a disorder where your liver does not produce a protein that is needed to allow your blood to clot. So basically, what I was missing whenever I would get cut or bleed internally, just like anybody does, those proteins would come together and fall apart because they just wouldn't work. So I didn't stop bleeding. Anybody deal with like seasonal allergies and nosebleeds? Or did you when you were a kid or anything? Yeah. Yeah, I had those too. So having a bleeding disorder and nosebleeds every spring and fall was absolutely terrible. Hemophilia was a real struggle for me because it would cause internal bleeding. So there were times that I couldn't walk. I did find out whenever I was young that it actually could be traced back to England, to members of the royal family. There were some pretty famous people that had hemophilia that died really young. And so you don't have to call me Your Highness, but yes, I have trace amounts of royal blood, or at least the disease that they carried in me. So it's not necessary, just I want you all to know it's there. So I had a lot of difficulty walking. My parents tried to raise us as normally as possible. They were encouraged to put us in a complete bubble, to wear a helmet, to wear braces, to do all these things. And my dad and my mother, they got together and they prayed, and they said, we're going to try to raise these kids as normal as possible, whatever normal is. They were going to try to raise them as normal as it was to be a Jones family around here. So we did that. It caused a lot of issues, though. We had a lot of problems. I had to relearn how to walk a couple of times from bleeding episodes that just wouldn't stop, and some of my joints and my muscles didn't work correctly anymore afterwards, and so we had to do physical therapy. Spent a lot of time in the hospital, when the nurses know what kind of candy bar you like you're there too much. And so it was kind of a challenge, but we kind of got used to it, like it was just life, you adapt to it. So whenever I was 9, they started teaching me how to infuse. Now, the way that you deal with hemophilia is the protein that you're missing. You mix up this medication and you put it into your vein. And so whenever I was 9, I started learning how to do that. And by 12, I was doing that by myself, which was kind of crazy. That I was asking my friends what they were doing, and I was like, I'm playing with needles. It was a weird thing, but it kind of became normal for us, So hemophilia was just a part of life. There's no cure for hemophilia. The only cure for it is a liver transplant, which won't work because you are a bleeder and you will bleed out and die. So they don't do liver transplants on hemophiliacs. And so there was going to be no cure. So 3 times a week, I would infuse and pump that medicine in there to try to keep bleeding episodes down. And if we had bleeding episodes, then we did more. It was also very expensive. For a short period of time, my parents lost insurance on us through a snafu, and it was costing $30,000 a month for our medication. So it took a lot of faith for my parents to be able to raise my brother and I with that. But God was so incredibly faithful. He really was. When I was 2, I got a hold of something sharp, and I got cut, and they had to take me to Cardinal Glennon, and I had to be infused. And at the time, the primary way that they dealt with this was they would use whole blood. The problem was that the whole blood often had things in it. So they wanted to try something new, and they said this would be something new we could try. So they had this medication. They said, this is an experiment. We want to try it. They did. It worked great. Worked for other kids, and that became kind of our go-to. But my parents found out years later that that medication was tainted with something. The blood that it had been derived from was infected. And they were called up to the hospital. The hospital brought a whole bunch of families in, and they were told, your son's been infected with a disease from the medication, but we don't know what it's called yet. We will let you know when we decide what to call it, but these are kind of its characteristics, and they explained them. A little while later, they officially designated it hepatitis C. So this was kind of a brand new thing, and they didn't know what to do with it, so they started trying to work on a cure, but they didn't know at the time what to do. So we just kind of went on with life. I did, not having any clue that this was in me. But whenever I was 14, it started getting really bad, and my parents set me down and explained to me after I turned 14 that this virus was in me. We went to the hospital. The doctors explained. They said, listen, this thing is starting to cause cirrhosis of your liver. You look like you've been drinking for a really long time, which at 14 would have been a real problem anyway, right? But it really was starting to cause some damage. And they said, this is going to be a real problem. We're working on a solution. We have an experimental treatment. But with this thing in your system, you are never going to be able to get married. You are never going to be able to have kids. You can't give this to anybody. So you're just going to have to survive until hopefully this medication works. So I was really brokenhearted because here I'm thinking bad enough I've got hemophilia. Girls really go for a bleeder, I'm telling you. And it was a difficult thing to deal with anyway. But here I have this bleeding disorder, and now I have this disease, and I'm not sure what to do. And I had kind of a breakdown. And my dad said, son, God has been faithful thus far. He's going to be faithful in the future. And so he was. Not long after, I started a medication. They said, we have an experimental treatment we want to try. We are going to nuke your system. We're going to destroy your immune system. And then this medication hopefully will try to fix it. And of course, there are a lot of medical terms I'm skipping over because you guys don't want to hear that. But just know, this was very complicated. And so for 14-year-old me, hearing all this crazy, scary stuff, I was absolutely terrified. They said, we're going to destroy your system. It's going to work. It's going to be a series of pills and shots in your stomach. And this is going to, but we think this might work. But it didn't. And for 6 months, we tried this, and I got really sick, and it didn't work. And they said, okay, we know this sounds bad, but this is our first real go at this, so give us some time. In so many words, they said, stay alive long enough for us to be able to figure this out. Problem was, they also told me that in the condition that my liver was in, that I may not live past 19 or 20 because there was no way I was going to be able to fight the disease off with just my immune system. It wasn't going to happen. So I had a family member who also had hemophilia, who was infected with something else, and they did die at 20. And so I was really struggling. I went to the funeral to mourn my cousin, whom I loved, and was one of the few people I could share the experience of being a bleeder with, and mourning him, and also thinking this is going to be where my family is going to be at in a few years. So we moved on some years later. We did some more testing, and the doctors were like, we have good news for you. Maybe the medicine did work. Maybe something happened. We don't know, but your levels have gone down, and you seem to be doing really, really well. And we think maybe we were mistaken about how bad this actually is. So they said, we think that you might be okay long enough, especially for us to come up with a new treatment. So they explained everything. They said, you can get married. You can have kids. We jumped the gun on all that stuff. You just got to be real careful. But all those things are possible. So I married the first girl who would have me. And despite all of those things, she loved me. We had been friends for a while. She loved me. And she said yes, I think despite her father in the beginning. But she said yes to marry me. And then we were very much in love. And despite all my character flaws, which they don't have a treatment for, she absolutely married me. And it was awesome. And we were really excited. And as time went on, it seemed like we were doing okay. The doctors were happy with my levels. And we thought, man, maybe they just really, this was overblown. We decided to try to have a baby. We didn't know if we could. We didn't know if I was healthy enough for us to. And we prayed, and God gave us a wonderful baby boy who I have to remember all the time that we prayed for this child, because sometimes he's difficult. And when he's difficult, I go, we prayed for this. And we love him very much. Sorry, Andrew. We love him very much. And God gave us a wonderful baby that we didn't know that we would even be able to have. But it was about 2 months from his due date, and the doctors called and they said, your last round of blood work is bad. The virus has doubled. It's going crazy. We're not sure what happened, but it's going crazy. You're going to need to come in. So we did, and we went in and talked with them. Long story very short. I know you're like, yeah, right, already. Long story very short, they told us that the virus was eating me up and that this was going to get really bad. They said, but we have good news for you. We have a new treatment. It's a new experimental treatment we want to try. Okay, what does it entail? Well, we are going to nuke your system. I was like, we've done this before. And so they said, we're going to do it again. It's going to be pills and shots, and it's going to make you really, really sick, but we think it's going to work this time. So we started this treatment, and for 6 months it worked, and we actually thought this is going to happen. And then it suddenly just quit. And not only did it stop working, it went through the roof. The numbers kept going up and up and up, and I started getting really sick. And the doctor said, it's going to be okay. Give us time. Stay alive as long as you possibly can. Give us time. We're going to find something that's going to work. So that's what we did, and we just kept going. I started getting really sick a couple years later, about 24. I started getting really sick. Went to the doctor, and they said, your gallbladder is having problems. You're going to have it taken out. Okay. So I'm in the hospital waiting for them to come and talk to me. And doctor came in, and she introduced herself, and she said, I'm with the transplant team. And I was looking at her very puzzling, and I said, I'm sorry, you have the wrong room. I'm here because my gallbladder's bad. And she said, yeah, I know. That's exactly why I'm here. Your gallbladder is bad because your liver's failing. Now, there's a whole God story in the fact that when I went to the ER for my gallbladder, she wasn't supposed to be working. Someone called out. She filled in. She is an expert at this kind of stuff. My file got sent to her as a just-in-case thing. She saw it. She saw something the other doctor missed. I mean, it was a God thing that I even was able to have this woman as my doctor. In fact, a few years ago, the hospital did a commercial, and she was the transplant surgeon that they had on there. And I was like, I know her. She's had her hands in my abdomen. And so it was really awesome. And so she come in, and she's talking to me, and I was like, okay, well, why are you here, though? And she said, because you need a transplant. And I was like, I'm sorry, you missed it on my file. I'm a hemophiliac. You can't do that. And she goes, I want to. I was like, I'm sorry. What are the chances of me even, what are the chances? And she said, well, 50-50 that you make it off the table. 50-50 you survive the first day. 50-50 the first 72 hours. 50-50 for the first week. 50-50 for the first 6 months that nothing develops and you have a big problem. She's like, what do you say? And I was like, she said it with such passion and excitement, like she was just revved up to go. And I was like, you're crazy. Which she is a little, which worked out for her. Because she said, I want to do this. She said, I want to save your life. But she goes, but I want something else too. I've come up in this system. It's male-dominated. There are more male transplant doctors, and they've done all the big things. And our next get-together, I want to be the only woman in the room that walks in and says, any of you chumps done a liver transplant on a bleeder and they survived? I didn't think so. And I just looked at her and I was like, I like you. So we shook hands and she said, we're going to do this. And that began a year-long process of preparing me for transplant. And there was a whole bunch of crazy stuff that God did and all that. All that wouldn't fit on the rock, by the way, so we just wrote, But I'm then find myself being wheeled into transplant. And they did it. And spoiler alert, I survived. I guess you figured that out. But odds were in my favor. But I don't know that if God had something for me to do or if it was just my wife talked to him so much about it, he was finally like, okay, I'll let him live. Whatever it was, God brought me through. And I'm going to be honest with you, there were times that I really wish he hadn't. There were times that I was laying there asking him, please just bring me home. I am so done with this. But he didn't do that, and she wouldn't let me, and she drugged me through all that stuff. So after I recovered from the transplant, I started doing better. A year later, though, they called and they said, hey, you remember that hepatitis C thing? That didn't get fixed. Your new liver, because you're taking immunosuppressants every day, which I still take, your liver now is getting eaten up. So your new liver is infected, and now it's causing problems. And we knew that was a possibility, but there was still that kind of hope. We hoped it would get fixed. And they said, but good news, we have an experimental treatment we want to try. I was like, okay, what are you going to do? And they said, well, we're going to nuke your system. And I was like, I've heard this before. So they said, yes, but this time we're really going to do it. And we're going to bring you to the point of death. And that we think is going to fix this, because then we can actually use the medication to treat it. And it was 48 weeks of, it's kind of like chemo every day, 48 weeks of it just breaking your body down. And there's a lot of crazy stuff that God did in the middle of that, including at one point me coming to the place where it made sense in my head to stop the misery for myself and my family. And I was plotting to take my own life because this is stupid. Like, why are we doing this? The math added up. And God brought me out of that moment. So we did the treatment, and it was miserable and awful and crazy and all of the things, but it worked. And in my office, I have a paper that shows the first blood draw that I had since I was 2 years old, showing that there is no virus in my system. It's undetected. And so we wrote that on a rock. So God has brought us through all these crazy things. Then after all of that, we wanted to have another child. I'm doing better. I'm going to actually live. This is great. And so we asked the doctors, and they were like, we don't know if you can or not. I mean, you've been through a lot. She's been through a lot when she was little. They said, but you can try. We had 2 miscarriages, which were hard. And if you've ever been there, you know how hard that is to bounce back from. And God brought us through those. And so we decided that, well, we won't keep trying for that. We will just go through fostering and adoption classes, and we will bring another child into our home that way. So we went through the whole process, everything. We got down to our last class. And guys, when there's something kind of off with your wife and you're like, what's going on? There was. So finally I was like, I think you need to take a pregnancy test. This is crazy. She was pregnant, and it wasn't supposed to be able to happen. But she was pregnant. And then we prayed the whole pregnancy. And now we have a young child, Alex, who is absolutely just full of joy and has the biggest heart. We never would have had him. He would have never existed had God not done just all of these things. A while later, because we had this class, I'm like, God, why did you have us go through this whole class just for us to be able to then have a child? Like, that was a huge waste of time. It wasn't. He had a plan, and we were asked to be emergency placement for a child who was in desperate need of a home and needed help. And there was a lot of crazy stuff going on, and we were able to take in that child, and were prepared for it well ahead of what we needed. And we were able to help. It was hard. If you've ever fostered kids, you know how hard it can be coming from homes that are broken or have been impacted by drugs and all kinds of things. And it was very difficult and scary at times. And we did everything we could do. And really long story short again, that little girl is now back with her dad and has been for a while, and their home has been brought back together. And it was God that brought us through that, because we had no idea what we were doing. The first week we had her, it was the father-daughter dance, and she asked me to go, and I'm like, I don't know anything about girls. I have no idea what I'm doing. And so we just jumped in with both feet. We prayed, and God just did so many amazing things. You guys, every one of you probably has a COVID story, right? Either you had COVID, you were impacted by COVID in some way, family member. Well, to be immunosuppressed and have COVID, every time they talked on the news about people that were elderly or who were immunocompromised, that was me. I was in that group. And so every time they said that, I was like, I really wish you'd stop saying that out loud. I'm tired of hearing that. We were exposed a dozen times, like standing right next to people who 2 days later were very sick and in the hospital, and God shielded us from that. There's no reason I should not have gotten COVID. I should have a couple of times, and God kept us from it. And we did not get COVID until earlier this year, and it's a much more mild strain now than what it was. Protected us from that until we got it this year, and all things considered, to be in our late 30s, maybe one of us just rolled over, to be in that and to bounce back as quick as we did with these other issues was just God. It was incredible. After I got all better, I started serving in churches, and I got hired up in the city to be the youth pastor at a church up there. And I was there for 30 days, and after me being there for 30 days, the pastor of 31 years suddenly resigned. I tried not to take that personally. He said it had nothing to do with me, but boy, it did feel that way. Because he'd been there for so long anyway. So he resigned and he left. And so it is me, the brand new youth pastor, the secretary of 5 months, and the church said they had 2 deacons. That's all they had. And they said, we're not sure what to do. And then COVID hit, and they said, Tag, you're it. You're going to have to be executive pastor while we run through all this stuff and figure this out. So I was like, guys, I came up here to play video games with kids and talk about Jesus. And now they put 120 adults in my charge and told me, you have to help navigate this and figure it out. If you know me at all, you know that was not in my wheelhouse. I had no idea what I was doing. We were operating with Jefferson County officials and other churches and politicians and all kinds of crazy stuff. It was a wild time, and there were times I kept thinking, God, why in the world did you bring us in this? But he had a plan, and he brought us through it. And we still have such great friends at that church. He was so incredibly faithful. And most of all, I would say, certainly last but not least, this June, Heather and I celebrated 20 years of marriage. And the fact that she was able to put up with me for 20 years, plus all this other stuff, is a testament to God's power and mercy because she has been through it. I am so grateful to have been married to her for this long. And I know that it was God for sure that he brought us through these things. So we wrote these things all down on these stones. We put them in our backyard and showed our kids. And our youngest son, Alex, was reading through them, and he said, Dad, we missed some stuff. And I was like, hemophilia, transplant, hepatitis, treatments. Like, what did we miss? And he's like, Dad, you didn't put food on there. He said, you didn't put love on there. You didn't put family on there. He said, not everybody has food, Dad. Not everybody has love. Not everybody has family like ours. We should thank God for those things. I gave him a candy bar. That was a really good answer. So we wrote those things down. And as we were finishing that up, he goes, Dad, we forgot the most important one of all. And again, I'm like, what did we forget? He said, Dad, we have Jesus. We've always had Jesus in our family. Not everybody has Jesus. Our family loves Jesus. He should be on a rock. I felt kind of bad that I didn't think of that. I probably should have. That should have been my first one. With Heather's ongoing health crisis, we've added her to this pile. She put her name on a rock because, as she puts it, one way or the other, no matter what happens or how this turns out, I'm going to be okay. Either here or over there, I will be okay because God keeps his promises. And we're going to move on because I'm not lingering on that for very long. So we're going to jump right back into Joshua chapter 4. We're going to go back to verse 20 and finish this out. Then Joshua set up in Gilgal the 12 stones they had taken from the Jordan. And he said to the Israelites, in the future, when your children ask their fathers, what is the meaning of these stones? You should tell your children, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the water of the Jordan before you until you had crossed over, just as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed over. This is so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the Lord's hand is strong, and so that you may always fear the Lord your God. Far too often we are very quick to forget what God has done for us and what he's brought us from. And if you've been saved for a really long time, sometimes we even forget just how sinful we were and how bad that we really were before we heard the gospel and he began to change our hearts. We move on far too quickly from the good things of God, and we linger far too long on everything else. I sometimes accuse my children of having a "what have you done for me lately" attitude. Where I'm thinking, I just bought you something 3 days ago, and now you need, there's no way you finished that video game. And I know, but I just saw this other video game. You never buy me anything. I've accused them of that, and then I kind of got convicted of it, going, I probably do the same thing to God. I am the proud owner of all of these rocks with these incredible things that he has done written on them, and I will wake up in the morning and go, God, what have you done for me yet today? In fact, my youngest son, not long ago, he fell into this really weird habit. All of a sudden, in the late afternoon, he would come in and say, Dad, are we having dinner tonight? Of course we're having dinner, son. And he would say, yeah, but are you making dinner tonight? Yes, we're having dinner. Well, it was funny at first, but after 2 weeks of every night being asked, and parents, I see some of you shaking your head like, oh yeah, we've had something like this. Yeah, after 2 weeks, I finally was like, son, of course we're having dinner. Have we ever not fed you? You have never missed a meal. 9 years, never missed a meal. And you've had a lot of snacks in between. Of course we're going to feed you. What makes you think that we are not going to feed you today? Of course we're going to feed you. And he said, yeah, but for some reason, I'm worried that you won't today. It is as important for us to tell our children and our grandchildren and others around us what God has done for us in the past as it is for us to be reminded of how faithful God has been, so that we don't fall into doubt and lose heart. Remembering good times and the bad are also important. Remembering how bad things were before God intervened in our lives. Remembering bad situations that God brought us through. We have to remember those things. We are so quick to forget. And I think God knows that. I mean, how many festivals, how many statues, how many different things did he say, do these things so you don't forget? I mean, good grief, guys, we celebrate communion once a month so we don't forget the blood of Jesus. And sometimes it's like, well, of course we're not going to forget that, but we do. We're supposed to remember how bad things have actually been. It's important for us to remember those things. It's important for us to tell our children, this is how terrible your dad was before Jesus really got a hold of me. It's important to tell your children, this is how bad your mom was. Just kidding, don't do that, guys. That's a setup, don't do it. Your mom was an angel. I needed Jesus. No, I'm just kidding. But to tell God how bad things were. My youngest son, he knows these things, but he doesn't really understand. My oldest son knows them better, but there are still things we haven't told him yet. But they're going to have to know. They're going to have to know things that happened and how awful they were. You can't hide your failures from your kids. You can't hide how hard life can be from your kids. We do it because we want to protect them. We do it because we want them to think good of us. But the problem is we're actually shielding them from the truth, and they're going to need the truth. They're going to need to know that when these things get really bad, this is where you turn. We don't want them to underestimate the power of the gospel because we undersold just how bad we were, how bad things have gotten. Don't diminish what God has done in your life by whitewashing your past. So that monument out at the Underhills, this particular one tells about what happened in the shut-in gap right there in front of their house, where advanced units of the rebel cavalry slipped through the area undetected until they approached a Union picket just outside of Arcadia. And those pickets alerted Major James Wilson, who was the head of the cavalry detachment in Ironton, who after he pulled all of his men together, they found him. There was a battle in Ironton. They fought back through Arcadia and fought back right there through where the Underhills live now. He held them there for hours until Confederate reinforcements came up and they were pushed back and he was wounded. They performed a fighting retreat back through Arcadia until it got so dark that they couldn't fight anymore, and then they made their way back to Fort Davidson. So he was being treated for his wounds the next day whenever they needed officers to help lead some of the men in the fight defending the fort. And so he and some of his other men and then a ragtag group of anybody who was available formed up and they went out and fought. He was captured along with 6 of his men. And then he was brought back through Ironton and back into Arcadia. This is where the headquarters was set up. And they were brought back here and they were processed as prisoners of war. They got their name and their unit, their rank. And then once they kind of collected all the prisoners and the battle was over, they began marching all of these captured Union soldiers back towards Fredericktown. When not far outside of Arcadia, they stopped the column and they asked for anyone who was a part of this particular cavalry regiment to come forward. So Major Wilson and his 6 men stepped forward, and they were then taken by guard over the hill and shot. What his unit had done the day before and what they had been known to do in the past really upset the rebel commanders, and they had him executed. And in 1906, Cyrus Peterson, the president of the Missouri Historical Society, compiled an account of Major Wilson. It's about a 20-page document. I read the whole thing because I'm a history nerd, and was very happy to do so, the things I do for this job. So I was super excited to do it, and I read through it. It was incredible, just the detail and all of the interviews he did with people who were still alive at the time who fought here. And through this, Cyrus Peterson said, "Younger generations will scarcely be able to comprehend the actual conditions then prevailing, and the true character of the raiders and their commander, and the hopeless depravity of the marauders under their commanding general who perpetrated this foul crime. It will thus appear that the murder of Major Wilson was merely one incident in the greatest carnival of crime ever enacted on American soil." He wanted to make sure that future generations would remember what happened to Major Wilson. He didn't want it to be romanticized. He didn't want it to be forgotten. He was concerned, he says later, that future generations are going to allow this kind of madness to happen again because they're going to romanticize it. It's not going to be that bad. Surely it wasn't as bad as what our grandparents said. Surely people aren't that evil. It's funny, we just had the reenactment, and huge history buff. I love that kind of stuff. It's awesome. But while reading this report, at one point I thought, man, I really wonder what Cyrus Peterson would think of us going out there and grabbing snacks and hanging out with our friends and laughing and having fun, watching these guys dress up and go out and play soldier and shoot blanks at each other. And you were like, man, this is crazy that this happened here in our backyard. But the part they leave out is the blood and the gore and the lack of humanity that both sides perpetrated on each other. And I just wondered, man, I wonder what he would think about this, because it seems like by reading his document that he was terrified of that. He was afraid that future generations would not understand just how evil people can be and how evil they were right here. We have to tell others what God has done for us, how bad things were, how bad we were, so that when they encounter sin and hurt and loss and sickness, marriage problems, financial problems, questions of their faith, they remember our stories. Stories of hope and salvation, redemption, moves of God. So they will know it from us. We should be reading the Bible to our children and to our grandchildren. We should be encouraging others to read. We should be doing Bible studies so that we know the stories. But then we also have to be telling people what God has done recently, what he's done for us today. So that way they know, well, if he's done that before, perhaps he'll do it again. If you'd like to turn to Psalm 77. Psalm 77, through all of this crazy we've been through, has been kind of stamped on my heart. 77 and 78. There was a time where I didn't know what to pray. I didn't know how to deal with some of these heavy things. I didn't feel like I had been adequately prepared for this level of suffering and sadness and everything, you know. How can you ever prepare somebody for some of these things? So I had someone suggest to me to read through the Psalms. If you're ever hurting and you've prayed and you don't know what to do, start reading through the Psalms and find a psalm that gives words to your hurt and start praying that. So for me, that was Psalm 77 and 78. We're going to start in verse 1. I cry aloud to God, and he will hear me. I sought the Lord in my day of trouble. My hands were continually lifted up all night long. I refused to be comforted. I think of God and I groan. I meditate. My spirit becomes weak. You have kept me from closing my eyes. I am troubled and cannot speak. I consider days of old, years long past. At night I remember my music. I meditate in my heart and my spirit ponders. Will the Lord reject forever and never again show favor? Has his faithful love ceased forever? Is his promise at an end for all generations? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in his anger withheld his compassion? So I say I am grieved that the right hand of the Most High has changed. Then in verse 11 he says, I will remember the Lord's works. Yes, I will remember your ancient wonders. I will reflect on all that you have done and meditate on your actions. God, your way is holy. What God is like God? You are the God who works wonders. You revealed your strength among the peoples. With power you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. The water saw you, God. The water saw you and it trembled. Even the depths shook. The clouds poured down water. The storm clouds thundered. Your arrows flashed back and forth. The sound of your thunder was in the whirlwind, lighting up the whole world. The earth shook and quaked. Your way went through the sea and your path through the vast water, but your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. And in Psalm 78, my people, hear my instruction. Listen to the words of my mouth. I will declare wise sayings. I will speak mysteries from the past, things we have heard and known and that our ancestors have passed down to us. We will not hide them from our children, but we will tell a future generation the praiseworthy acts of the Lord, his might, and the wondrous works he has performed. He established a testimony in Jacob and set up a law in Israel, which he commanded our ancestors to teach to their children, so that a future generation, children yet to be born, might know. They were to rise and tell their children so they might put their confidence in God and not forget God's works, but to keep his commands. Well, if you noticed it there, right there around verse 11, he went from having a pity party and asking God where he was to saying, nothing changed in that moment. Nothing stopped. God didn't speak or intervene. He just went from, I'm grieved that God has changed, to, I will choose to remember the deeds of the Lord. I will remember. So I want to encourage you to write the stories of God's faithfulness on stones or paper or make videos, whatever they are, for your kids and for your grandkids. Ed Tennant does this. He spoke of that a couple of months ago. He's been doing that for his grandkids so that they know. You've got to tell the stories of what God has done for you and in you often with honesty so that your children and your grandchildren and others around you are going to know what God has done so that they can put their confidence in him. You have to read the word with them. Read the word with your kids and your grandkids and with others. And then your testimony then is the gap of what happened thousands of years ago, what he promised thousands of years ago that he would do, and you say, hey, he's still doing it because he did this in me. He still does it now. Because the stories that you've lived, the ways God has impacted you, what he's brought you from, those are not just your stories. You don't own those stories. No more than Abraham or David or Peter or Paul. Those weren't just their stories of what God had done either. They're part of God's story of what he has done. His mighty acts of faithfulness. You must choose to remember them and share them with others so that they may know God and they may make him known. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day, Lord. Thank you for all that you have done. God, thank you for the book of Joshua. Lord, thank you for chapter 4 and what it has meant in our life and how it has helped us cope with things, Lord. Thank you for Psalm 77 and 78. Lord, thank you for allowing David and the other authors of the Psalms to put words to things that sometimes we're